Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life by Jon Lee Anderson. There's a black and white photograph from a dusty Bolivian village in 1967 that has haunted the world for decades. A man lies on a concrete wash basin in a hospital laundry room, shirtless, eyes open, his face strikingly handsome, even in death, framed by tangled hair and a scraggly beard. To some, the image looked eerily Christ-like. To his enemies, it was proof their greatest threat was finally gone. To his followers, it marked the birth of a martyr. The man was Ernesto Che Guevara. But what happened next is almost as strange as the life he lived. After displaying his body to the world, the Bolivian military, with CIA advisors looking on, made him disappear. They secretly buried him and his comrades in an unmarked grave, hoping to prevent his resting place from becoming a shrine. For 30 years, the world wondered where he was. His enemies wanted to erase him from history, while his followers transformed his image into one of the most recognizable symbols on earth. That famous portrait of him in a black beret with a single star has appeared on everything from T-shirts to protest banners, becoming a universal icon of rebellion. But who was the man behind the myth? How does a well-born, asthmatic boy from a wealthy Argentine family, a boy who loves poetry and rugby, become a global revolutionary figure willing to sacrifice everything for an ideal? Family, comfort, even his own life? And why would someone who had reached the heights of power as a commander in the Cuban Revolution, a man who seemingly had it all, give it all up to die alone in the jungles of a foreign country? That's the mystery at the heart of Jon Lee Anderson's masterpiece, Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life. This isn't just a biography. It's a detective story that took Anderson 5 years of relentless investigation, including moving his own family to Cuba to piece together. He gained unprecedented access to Che's unpublished diaries, and even his widow, Aleda March. Anderson didn't just write this book. He lived it. He even played a key role in discovering Che's hidden remains. Today, we're going to journey through this incredible story. By the end, you'll understand the forces that forged this complex man, the passionate idealist, and the cold-hearted executioner. You'll see how a motorcycle trip across a continent transformed a young doctor into a man with a mission. And you'll witness the tragic, almost inevitable, final chapter of a life lived on the very edge of human conviction. This is the story of a man who tried to create a new man, and in the process, became an enduring, controversial legend. The story of Che Guevara begins with a secret. According to his birth certificate, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928. But decades later, his mother, Celia, confided the truth to a friend. Her first son was actually born a month earlier, on May 14th. She and Che's father falsified the date to hide a small scandal from the prying eyes of Buenos Aires society. She was already 3 months pregnant on her wedding day. It's a fitting start for a man who would spend much of his life wrapped in clandestine activities, a life that began with a necessary deception. His parents, Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna, were from the crumbling Argentine aristocracy. They were blue-blooded, well-educated, and possessed an adventurous, rebellious spirit that set them apart from their conservative peers. Shortly after their wedding, they fled the stuffy confines of the city for the remote jungles of Misiones, a wild northern province, to start a yerba mate plantation. Charmaine's father saw it as a grand adventure, a place of ferocious beasts, dangerous work, robbery, and murders. For a short time it was a honeymoon idyll. But this wilderness life was cut short. After Che, or Ernestito, little Ernesto as he was called, was born in the city of Rosario, the family's life was upended by a single, fateful event. One chilly day in May 1930, his mother took the 2-year-old for a swim. That night, the little boy had a terrible coughing fit. A doctor diagnosed him with asthmatic bronchitis. It was the beginning of a chronic, lifelong battle with asthma that would shape not only his own character, but the destiny of his entire family. The damp climate of the Riverlands was too much for him, forcing the family to move, eventually settling in the dry mountain air of Alta Gracia, a small resort town in the province of Córdoba. They thought it would be a short stay, but it became their home for the next 11 years. Here, in this small town, the boy the world would come to know, as Che began to emerge. His illness was a kind of curse, confining him to bed for days on end, gasping for breath. During these long, solitary hours, he found refuge in books, devouring adventure stories by Jules Verne and Alexandre Dumas, and in playing chess with his father. But when he was well, he burst with irrepressible energy. He threw himself into sports, soccer, swimming, hiking, pushing his physical limits, often to the point of collapse, returning home, wheezing and exhausted in the arms of his friends. His mother, Celia, a free-thinking and rebellious woman herself, encouraged him. She insisted her son live as normal a life as possible, a decision that put her in constant conflict with her more cautious husband. Their household was famously bohemian and chaotic. The children were allowed to ride their bicycles through the living room, and friends from all walks of life were welcome at their dinner table. But behind this lively exterior, the marriage was strained by financial troubles and Che's father's affairs with other women. The loud arguments between his parents became a regular feature of Che's childhood. Young Ernestito was known as a wild and disobedient boy, a leader of the local youth gangs or barras, who engaged in rock fights and pranks. He drank ink from a bottle, ate chalk in class, and played bullfighter with a ram. This fierce, competitive spirit, this need to test his own boundaries, was a direct response to the physical weakness his asthma imposed on him. He developed an iron will and remarkable self-discipline, traits that were already clearly visible in the young boy from Alta Gracia. His formal education was often interrupted by his illness, and his mother became his primary tutor, teaching him to read and write and instilling in him a love for literature and French. This period forged a powerful bond between mother and son. They were kindred spirits, rebellious, intuitive, and unafraid of courting danger. The first major political event to capture young Ernesto's imagination was the Spanish Civil War. His family staunchly supported the Republican cause against Franco's fascists, and their home in Alta Gracia became a refuge for Spanish exiles. Ernesto would mark the positions of the armies on a map with little flags. When World War II broke out, his father became active in a pro-Allied group, and 11-year-old Ernesto joined its youth wing, helping his father monitor suspected Nazi activities in the area. These early political stirrings, however, were more a reflection of his family's passions than his own deep convictions. When he entered high school in the city of Córdoba, he was still largely uninterested in politics. His friends remember him as an intellectual rascal, more interested in rugby, literature, and shocking his peers than in student activism. He developed a reputation for his fearless, headlong attacks on the rugby pitch, earning the nickname Fuser, a mashup of furibundo, meaning furious, and his mother's surname, de la Serna. He also proudly boasted about how seldom he bathed, which earned him another nickname, Chancho, or the pig. Behind this confrontational exterior, however, a more serious mind was at work. He read voraciously, diving into Freud, Baudelaire, and Faulkner. He even started his own philosophical dictionary, a notebook filled with quotes and ideas from thinkers like Bertrand Russell and Jack London. By the time he was a teenager, his reading tastes began to shift toward novels with strong social content, books that dealt with the lives of Latin America's marginalized and indigenous peoples. His friend Osvaldo Bidinost believed that this literature gave Ernesto his first real glimpse of the vast, unequal continent that lay beyond his own privileged world. As Che himself would later write, in his adolescence he had no social preoccupations and took no part in the political struggles of Argentina. That was all about to change. In 1947, after 15 years away, the Guevara family returned to Buenos Aires. It was not a happy homecoming. His parents' marriage had finally collapsed, and their finances were in ruins. Shortly after their return, his beloved paternal grandmother, Ana Isabel, suffered a stroke and died. Che was at her side for 17 days, patiently trying to feed her and comfort her until the end. Her death left him grief-stricken. In the wake of this loss, Che made a life-altering decision. He abandoned his plan to study engineering and enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. He later said he dreamed of becoming a famous researcher, of discovering something that could be given to all of humanity. But his choice of specialty revealed a more personal motive. He decided to focus on allergies, driven by an obsession to find a cure for his own condition. The move to Buenos Aires also marked the beginning of a profound shift in Che's worldview. His family's financial collapse and the death of his grandmother had shattered his sense of security. For the first time, he felt the weight of family responsibility. He began to see the world not just through books but through direct experience. He started traveling. At first, they were short hitchhiking trips, but gradually his journeys grew longer and more ambitious. In 1950, he set out on his first major solo adventure, a 500-mile trip through northern Argentina, on a bicycle fitted with a small motor. On this journey, he began keeping a diary, a habit that would become a lifelong ritual. For the first time, he came face to face with the harsh realities of his country. He met itinerant workers or leñeras who drifted from one harvest to another and was struck by the contrast between his own recreational adventure and their life of constant struggle. He visited a leper colony with his old friend Alberto Granado, who was working there as a doctor. He was deeply affected by the poverty and resignation of the indigenous people he encountered in the northern provinces. He wrote in his journal about the beaten race, whose stares were tame, almost fearful, and completely indifferent to the outside world. He was beginning to see the world in a new light, a world divided between the privileged and the oppressed. In a moment of epiphany, in a dense forest, he wrote of his growing hate of civilization, the absurd image of people moving like locos, to a rhythm that was the hateful opposite of peace. These travels were planting a seed, but the defining journey was yet to come. In late 1951, Che's restless spirit found a new outlet. His friend, the biochemist Alberto Granado, who was nearly 30, decided that if he didn't take his long-dreamed-of trip across South America now, he never would. He needed a companion, and he knew just who to ask. Che, restless and lovelorn after a passionate but ultimately doomed romance with a wealthy young woman named Chichina Ferreira, accepted on the spot. On January 4, 1952, the two friends set out from Córdoba on Alberto's sputtering old Norton 500 motorcycle, which they nicknamed La Poderosa, the powerful one. Their plan was simple, guided by what Che called improvisation. They would travel the length of the continent, working their way as they went, hoping to eventually reach North America. The journey, later immortalized in Che's motorcycle diaries, was the crucible in which the revolutionary was forged. For 9 months, they traveled through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. They were, as Che put it, mongueros motorizados, motorized scroungers, surviving on their wits and the kindness of strangers. They slept in police stations, barns, and firehouses. In Chile, they audaciously passed themselves off as leprosy experts, gaining them free meals and newspaper articles that praised their scientific dedication. But beneath the youthful adventure, a deeper transformation was taking place. In the massive Chuquicamata copper mine in Chile, the largest open-pit mine in the world, Che saw the stark reality of foreign exploitation. He wrote with disdain of the blonde, efficient, and impertinent American administrators who ran the mine, contrasting them with the miserable conditions of the Chilean workers. He met a miner, a communist who had been jailed for striking, and his wife, shivering in the cold desert night without even a blanket. They were a live representation of the proletariat of any part of the world, Che wrote. For the first time, he felt a true sense of fraternity with this strange human species. The journey into Peru was even more profound. Here, the legacy of the Spanish conquest was everywhere. He saw the majestic ruins of Machu Picchu in the Incan Empire, a testament to a magnificent civilization crushed by European invaders. And he saw its living legacy in the subjugated indigenous people, the Papuca, beaten race, living in squalor and servitude. He traveled with them in the back of crowded trucks, separated from them only by the privilege of his white skin. In a leper colony deep in the Peruvian Amazon, he and Alberto lived and worked among the patients for several weeks. On his 24th birthday, Che gave a toast, not just to his hosts, but to a new ideal forming in his mind. He spoke of the division of America into illusory and uncertain nationalities as a fiction. "We constitute a single mestizo race," he declared, raising his glass for Peru and for a united America. By the time he returned to Argentina in August 1952, he was a changed man. As he wrote in his journal, the person who wrote these notes died upon stepping once again onto Argentine soil. "I am not the person I was before. The vagabonding through our America has changed me more than I thought." He threw himself into his studies and, less than a year later, earned his medical degree. But the pull of the road, the call of our America, was too strong. On July 7, 1953, he left Argentina again, this time with his friend, Calica Ferrer. He would never live in his homeland again. Their journey took them first to Bolivia, a country in the throes of revolution. The nationalist government had nationalized the powerful tin mines and was about to enact a sweeping agrarian reform. The city of La Paz was electric with tension, filled with armed workers, militias, and marching peasants. Che was fascinated. "Human life has little importance here," he wrote to his father. "This makes this a profoundly interesting situation to the neutral observer." But it was his next stop that would prove to be the point of no return. In December 1953, Che arrived in Guatemala. Here, a democratically elected leftist government, led by Jacobo Arbenz, was attempting its own radical social reforms, including a land reform program that had expropriated the vast, unused lands of the powerful American-owned United Fruit Company. In response, Washington, viewing Arbenz as a communist threat, was already plotting his overthrow. The CIA had armed and trained a force of right-wing exiles, led by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, preparing for an invasion. Guatemala City was a magnet for political exiles and revolutionaries from all over Latin America, and Che plunged into this fervent atmosphere. It was here that he met Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian exile and political activist who introduced him to key figures in the Arbenz government. And it was here that he met a group of young Cuban exiles who had just participated in a failed armed attack against the Moncada army barracks in Cuba. an attack led by a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. One of them, Nico Lopez, spoke with passionate conviction about their struggle and their leader. He told Che that, if Cuba had produced anything good since Martí, it was Fidel Castro. Che was impressed. He declared his intention to stay in Guatemala, come what may. He swore before a picture of Stalin that he wouldn't rest until he saw the capitalist octopuses annihilated. He was finally ready to move beyond being an observer. He wanted to be an authentic revolutionary. In June 1954, the CIA-backed invasion began. As planes bombed the capital, Che experienced combat for the first time. He felt a magic sensation of invulnerability and joined a militia organized by the communist youth, ready to fight. But the fight was over before it began. Betrayed by his own military, President Arbenz resigned and sought asylum. For Che, the fall of Guatemala was a terrible shower of cold water, a bitter lesson in the realities of power. He saw firsthand how a revolution could be crushed when it failed to purge its army of disloyal officers and arm its people. It was a mistake, he vowed, that would not be repeated. Marked as a red, Che sought asylum in the Argentine embassy and eventually made his way to Mexico City. He was broke and disillusioned, but his revolutionary convictions had been forged in the fire of Guatemala. He was no longer a neutral observer. He was a committed Marxist, searching for a cause. He found it in July 1955. At the apartment of a Cuban exile, he was introduced to the leader of the Moncada attack, Fidel Castro. They talked for 10 hours straight that first night, and by the end of it, Che had enlisted as the doctor for Fidel's planned guerrilla expedition to Cuba. He wrote to his parents, finally coming clean about his intentions. "My future is linked with that of the Cuban Revolution," he told them. "I either triumph with it or die there." He had found his leader, and he had found his war. The next year was a whirlwind of clandestine preparation. Che, along with about 80 other men, underwent rigorous military training under the tutelage of General Alberto Bayo, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. Che excelled, becoming one of the most disciplined and respected members of the group, and a trusted member of Fidel's inner circle. He married his Guatemalan love, Hilda Gadea, and in February 1956, their daughter, Hildita, was born. But his new family life took a back seat to the revolution. In June, he and Fidel and dozens of others were arrested by the Mexican police. Che spent 57 days in jail. Finally, on November 25, 1956, Che and 81 other fighters crammed aboard a leaky, overloaded yacht called the Granma and set sail for Cuba. The journey was a 7-day nightmare of seasickness and storms. Their landing was a disaster. They ran aground in a mangrove swamp, miles from their intended rendezvous point, and were spotted by Batista's forces. 3 days later, on December 5th, as the exhausted rebels rested in a sugarcane field at a place called Alegría de Pio, they were ambushed by the army. It was a massacre. The rebels panicked and scattered. In that chaotic moment, Che faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He saw a box of ammunition and a medical kit lying on the ground. Without hesitation, he grabbed the ammunition. Moments later, he was hit by a bullet in the neck. Believing he was mortally wounded, he lay down, strangely calm, thinking of a Jack London story about a man freezing to death with dignity. A comrade shook him out of his reverie and dragged him to safety. Of the 82 men who had landed from the Granma, only about 22 managed to regroup in the rugged Sierra Maestra Mountains. The revolution seemed to be over before it had even begun. But Fidel was undeterred. "The days of the dictatorship are numbered," he declared to his small band of survivors. For the next 2 years, the Sierra Maestra became the laboratory for Che's theories of guerrilla warfare. In this isolated, self-contained world, he was transformed. He proved to be an audacious and fearless fighter, often reckless in his disregard for his own safety. He became a strict disciplinarian, demanding absolute commitment from his men and showing little mercy to deserters or suspected traitors. It was Che who carried out the revolution's first execution of a traitor, an event he later described in his memoirs with chilling, literary detachment. But he was also a teacher and a builder. He taught illiterate peasant recruits how to read and write, set up a rudimentary hospital, a shoe factory, and an armory that produced primitive grenades they called Sputniks. He founded the rebel newspaper El Cubano Libre and the clandestine radio station Radio Rebelde. In July 1957, in recognition of his leadership, Fidel promoted him to Comandante, the highest rank in the rebel army. He was the first to receive the honor. By August 1958, after defeating a massive army offensive, Fidel decided the time was right to take the war to the rest of the island. He ordered Che and another charismatic commander, Camilo Cienfuegos, to lead 2 columns out of the Sierra and march across the country to the central province of Las Villas. The 6-week march across the swampy plains of Camagüey was an ordeal of hunger, thirst, and constant harassment by the army. But in mid-October, Che's exhausted column finally reached the Escambray Mountains of Las Villas. Here, Che faced a different kind of battle. The mountains were a chaotic patchwork of rival anti-Batista guerrilla groups, including the anti-communist Second National Front and the student-led Directorio Revolucionario. They were suspicious of Che, the foreign communist, and he in turn viewed them with contempt. But he needed their cooperation. Through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and sheer force of will, he managed to forge a fragile unity and establish himself as the supreme commander of the rebel forces in the province. During this time, a young, blonde activist from the local underground, Aleda March, became his trusted courier and constant companion. Amid the chaos of war, they fell in love. In the final days of December 1958, Che launched his final offensive. His target was Santa Clara, the provincial capital and a strategic military hub. With just 340 men, he faced a garrison of 500 soldiers backed by tanks and planes. The battle for Santa Clara was the decisive engagement of the war. On December 29th, Che's men used a bulldozer to tear up the railway tracks and derailed an armored train sent by Batista to reinforce the city. The capture of the train, with its huge cache of weapons and ammunition, broke the morale of the army. After 3 days of fierce street fighting, the city fell. The victory was the death knell for the Batista regime. On New Year's Day 1959, Batista fled Cuba. The war was over. Che and Camilo were ordered to march on Havana. On January 2nd, Che's column entered the capital to a hero's welcome. He was 30 years old. The revolutionary had triumphed. Now the builder had to create his new world. The first few years after the victory were a whirlwind of activity for Che. He was a Cuban citizen by birthright, a hero of the revolution, and one of the most powerful men in the country. He took command of the La Cabaña fortress, the sprawling colonial garrison overlooking Havana harbor. From there, he presided over the revolutionary tribunals as the supreme prosecutor, overseeing the summary trials and executions of hundreds of police torturers, war criminals, and others deemed enemies of the new state. He was unrepentant about his role. "The executions are not only a necessity for the people of Cuba," he declared, but also an imposition by the people. He was determined to avoid the mistake of Guatemala, where the failure to purge the old army had led to the revolution's downfall. In November 1959, Fidel appointed him president of the National Bank. It was a deliberately provocative move. Che, who openly disdained money as a capitalist fetish, signed the new banknotes with his nickname alone, Che. Then, in February 1961, he became the Minister of Industries, charged with the monumental task of transforming Cuba's dependent, single-crop economy into a diversified industrial power. This was his laboratory for creating the new man. Che envisioned a society where individualism would disappear, replaced by a collective consciousness. He believed that true communism could only be achieved through a change in human consciousness, not just economic structures. He championed moral incentives over material ones, arguing that people should work for the good of society, not for personal gain. He initiated the concept of volunteer labor, spending his own Sundays cutting sugarcane or working on construction sites, expecting his colleagues and the rest of the country to follow his example. He was, as one observer noted, the Jacobin of the revolution, the most puritanical and demanding of its leaders. He was notoriously austere, refusing to take more than his modest comandante's salary, and insisting his family live without privileges. His blunt honesty and intolerance for flattery or incompetence were legendary. He was a man, as his mother said, driven by a tout-jeté, tremendous necessity for totality and purity. Behind the scenes, he was also the chief architect of Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union. It was Che who negotiated the first major trade deals with Moscow and the Eastern Bloc, securing the economic and military lifeline that would allow Cuba to survive the inevitable break with the United States. He traveled the world as Cuba's revolutionary ambassador, meeting with leaders like Nasser in Egypt, Nehru in India, and Sukarno in Indonesia. But Che was never just a Cuban minister. He saw Cuba not as an end, but as a beginning, a base for a continental revolution that would sweep through Latin America. From the very first days of the triumph, he was secretly meeting with, training, and aiding guerrilla movements from Nicaragua, Guatemala, Peru, and his native Argentina. He wrote his manual, Guerrilla Warfare, as a blueprint for others to follow. Its central message was a direct challenge to the orthodox communist parties. A small band of determined fighters, a FOCO, didn't have to wait for the perfect objective conditions for revolution. They could create them. This belief put him increasingly at odds with the Soviet Union, which preached a doctrine of peaceful coexistence with the West. Che saw this as appeasement. He was deeply disappointed by what he saw on his visits to the Soviet Union, a society he felt was still driven by material interests, creating not a new man, but a pale imitation of a Yankee. He became more and more drawn to the revolutionary fervor of Mao's China. The breaking point was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when Khrushchev, without consulting Fidel, struck a deal with Kennedy to withdraw the missiles. Che was enraged. He felt betrayed. He told a British journalist that if the missiles had been under Cuban control, they would have been fired. The rift was now ideological and profound. Che Guevara became the most vocal critic of the Soviet Union within the socialist world. In a fiery speech in Algiers in February 1965, he accused the socialist countries of being tacit accomplices to imperialist exploitation by engaging in unequal trade with developing nations. It was an astounding breach of protocol, a public declaration of his independence from Moscow's dictates. By this point, Che knew his time in Cuba was coming to an end. He was a political liability for Fidel, who needed to maintain the Soviet lifeline. More importantly, Che felt the pull of the battlefield. He was, as a friend said, a caged lion. He was a creator of revolutions, not an administrator. In the spring of 1965 he made his decision. He would leave Cuba and carry the fight to new fronts. On April 1st, after saying a disguised and heartbreaking farewell to his children, he disappeared from public view. He left behind a letter to Fidel, renouncing his positions, his rank, and his Cuban citizenship. "Other nations of the world call for my modest efforts," he wrote. "The time has come for us to part." His first destination was Africa. Che believed that the Congo, torn by a brutal civil war, could become a new Vietnam, a focal point for the anti-imperialist struggle on the continent. At the head of a secret force of 130 black Cuban fighters, he arrived in the Congo in April 1965, disguised and using the nom de guerre, Tatu. The mission, which he chronicled in his unpublished diary as the story of a failure, was a disaster from the start. He found the Congolese rebel leaders to be corrupt, divided by tribal rivalries, and more interested in the perks of power in comfortable exile than in fighting. Their soldiers were undisciplined, poorly trained, and believed that a magic potion, or dawa, made them immune to bullets. For 7 agonizing months, Che tried to forge a disciplined fighting force out of this chaos. He suffered from dysentery and relentless asthma attacks, and watched as his own men became demoralized. The Congolese rebels simply wouldn't fight. The basic characteristic of the Popular Liberation Army, he wrote, was that of a parasitic army. In November 1965, with the rebel front collapsing under an offensive by white mercenaries and the Tanzanian government withdrawing its support, Che was forced to order a humiliating retreat. There was not a trace of grandeur in this retreat, he wrote, as he and his men escaped across Lake Tanganyika in the dead of night. I had to reject men who pleaded to be taken along. A desolate, sobering, and inglorious spectacle. Che spent the next several months in hiding, first in the Cuban embassy in Tanzania, and then in a safe house near Prague. He was a man in limbo, a revolutionary without a revolution. He was depressed and filled with self-reproach. "My responsibility is great," he wrote in his Congo diary. "I will not forget the defeat, nor its most precious lessons." But he hadn't given up. During this period of forced inactivity, he planned his next and final campaign. The target was Bolivia. He believed Bolivia, with its central location, impoverished indigenous population, and unstable military government, was the ideal place to create a mother foco that would ignite revolutionary wars across South America, eventually reaching his homeland, Argentina. In November 1966, disguised as a middle-aged Uruguayan economist, Che arrived in La Paz and made his way to a remote jungle base camp in the Nyancahuazu region of southeastern Bolivia. He had a small force of about 50 men, a mix of trusted Cuban veterans from the Sierra Maestra and the Congo, and a handful of Bolivian recruits, mostly from the Communist Party. From the very beginning, the Bolivian mission was plagued by the same problems that had doomed him in the Congo, plus some new ones. The Bolivian Communist Party, led by Mario Monge, was deeply suspicious of Che's adventurism. At a tense New Year's Eve meeting in the camp, Monge demanded overall command of the movement. Che refused. Monge left, and Che's guerrillas were cut off from their most vital urban support network. The local peasants were fearful and hostile, consistently informing on the guerrillas' movements to the army. The terrain was brutal, far more difficult than the Sierra Maestra, and the men were constantly sick, hungry, and exhausted. Che himself, now 39, suffered terribly from asthma, with no medicine to relieve it. In March 1967, after two of his deserters were captured and talked, the army discovered their main camp and their carefully hidden supply caves. Che's presence in Bolivia was no longer a secret. The Bolivian government, with the help of the CIA, launched a massive counterinsurgency campaign. The U.S. sent in Green Beret advisors to train a special Bolivian Ranger battalion. The noose began to tighten. His only link to the outside world was severed when his two key contacts, the French writer Régis Debray and the Argentine artist Ciro Bustos, were captured. Che's force was split in two after a disastrous reconnaissance march, and he spent months desperately trying to find the other column, led by his trusted commander, Joaquin. He didn't know that on August 31st, Joaquin's column, which included Tanya Bunke, had been ambushed and wiped out. By October, Che's remaining band was reduced to just 17 starving, exhausted men, hunted like animals through the barren canyons near the village of La Higuera. His diary from this period is a grim chronicle of hunger, sickness, and despair. "I am inevitably approaching the age when my future as a guerrilla must be reconsidered," he wrote on his 39th birthday. "For now, I'm still in one piece." On October 8, 1967, betrayed by a peasant, Che and his men were cornered in a narrow ravine called the Quebrada del Churro by the Bolivian Rangers. The battle began in the early afternoon. Che's M2 rifle was destroyed by a bullet, and another shot wounded him in the leg. Unable to fight, he was captured. He was taken to a dilapidated one-room schoolhouse in La Higuera and held overnight. The next morning, a Cuban-American CIA agent named Felix Rodriguez arrived by helicopter to identify him and interrogate him. Che refused to talk, but he conducted himself with quiet dignity. The order came from the Bolivian High Command in La Paz: proceed with the elimination of Señor Guevara. Just before 1 p.m., a Bolivian sergeant named Mario Terán entered the schoolhouse. According to legend, Che's last words were, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." Terán fired a burst from his rifle. The bullets tore into Che's arms and legs. Then, another burst hit him in the chest, filling his lungs with blood. The man was dead, but the myth had just begun. So, what do we make of this life? A life of such incredible drama, of such soaring idealism, and, ultimately, of such profound tragedy. Jon Lee Anderson's biography gives us the most complete picture we've ever had of Ernesto Che Guevara. And what emerges is not a simple hero or a simple villain, but a man of staggering complexity, a man riddled with contradictions. He was a romantic who loved poetry, yet he could be a cold and calculating executioner. He was an aristocrat by birth, who dedicated his life to the world's most wretched and oppressed. He was a doctor, sworn to save lives, who chose to become a warrior, a man who believed that violence was the necessary midwife of a new, more just world. One of the most powerful themes in this book is the idea of sacrifice. Che demanded it of everyone, but most of all, he demanded it of himself. His entire life was a relentless battle against his own limitations. His physical weakness from asthma, his personal desires, his very sense of self. He believed that the new man he dreamed of could only be forged in the crucible of struggle and self-denial. He wanted to strip away everything that was bourgeois, everything that was individualistic, until only the pure revolutionary remained. And in many ways he succeeded. He gave up his career, his family, his country, and ultimately, his life. He truly believed, as he wrote to his parents in his final letter, that he was one of those who put their lives on the line to demonstrate their truths. But was his truth the right one? His vision of a continental revolution, of 2, 3, many Vietnams, was a vision that, if realized, would have engulfed the world in unimaginable bloodshed. His economic policies in Cuba contributed to years of hardship for the very people he sought to liberate, and his role in the revolutionary tribunals, his unblinking willingness to execute his enemies, will forever stain his legacy. Anderson's book doesn't shy away from these dark corners. It presents the man in full, the courage and the cruelty, the intelligence and the naivete, the compassion and the fanaticism. And yet, decades after his death, his image continues to inspire. Why? Perhaps it's because, in our often cynical and compromised world, there's something undeniably powerful about a person who's willing to die for what they believe in. Che's life, for all its flaws, was a life of absolute conviction. He never wavered. He never sold out. He chose his path, and he followed it to its bitter, lonely end in the Bolivian mountains. The great lesson of this book, I think, isn't about whether Che was right or wrong. It's about the staggering power of a single, focused human will. It's a story about what can happen when an idea takes hold of a person so completely that it becomes their entire reason for being. What can you, a young person on the verge of your own life's journey, take from this? You don't have to start a guerrilla war, but you can ask yourself, what do I believe in? What are my convictions? And what am I willing to do to live a life that's true to them? Che's story is a stark reminder that a life without conviction is a life half-lived. He chose his path, and he gave everything for it. The question this book leaves us with is, what will we choose for ourselves? That was the story of Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life by Jon Lee Anderson. We've covered the grand sweep of his journey today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary can only scratch the surface. The real power of this book is in the details, in the quiet moments of reflection from Che's own diaries, in the eyewitness accounts that Anderson so painstakingly gathered. This summary is designed to help you decide if this incredible life story is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or challenged your perspective, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that will make you think deeply about the nature of ideals, sacrifice, and what it truly means to live a life of consequence. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, and you want to explore more of the monumental lives and powerful ideas that have shaped our world, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us continue to bring these stories to you. Let's keep learning and growing together.